Today on What is Tabletop, we talk about sci-fi. All right, so Frank, when you're editing the video, we're going to have a scroll that comes up like in Star Wars, and we're going to talk about...
Charles, you know Star Wars is... I mean, it's sci-fi, but it's sci-fi, you know? Like, it doesn't really count.
What do you mean?
It's more fantasy than sci-fi.
It's all make-believe.
Yeah, I guess so. And so we're going to talk about that on today's episode of What is Tabletop. My name's Frank. We don't always go through our bits before we film them. And this is Charles.
Hey, I do go through my bits.
Yeah, his drill bits got up. I couldn't think of anything
else. I hope
else
that makes the cut.
I can't think of anything else that has bits in it. And it's like, you have a drill, right?
Yeah, I do.
All right, then it works.
All right, perfect.
Frank's joke, successful. Was it funny? You decide. Anyway, we're talking about all things tabletop RPGs. That isn't just Dungeons and Dragons, but we're probably going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons a little bit. Just a teeny bit.
Today, I guess a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it's possible.
Yeah, there's literally a sci-fi version of Dungeons and Dragons that Wizards of the Coast made. So we'll talk about that for like 2 seconds. But anyway, before we do that, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Please help us to like, comment, and subscribe. It gets the video out more. We're wanting more people to see this. And yeah, that's all the fun things there. Yeah.
Oh boy.
Oh bother.
Oh bother.
Why did you go to Mickey?
Because he's the one who goes.
Anyway, Charles, what are we talking about?
We are talking about sci-fi RPGs today.
Mm-hmm.
As you can see in front of us, we've got a plethora. That means a lot.
I think a plethora just means like a wide amount. We could look this up, but let us know in the comments who's more right.
Right. So we're going to be talking about different science fiction tabletop role-playing games today. Just, let you know what's out there. Maybe you've played some of them, maybe you haven't. So we're going to talk about them.
So you're probably saying, isn't there a sci-fi otherworldly space version for D&D? Yes, it's called Spelljammer. It doesn't really count.
Yeah, it counts about as much as Star Wars does.
Which we'll get into. But if you're like, but I just want to play D&D, Spelljammer or Starfinder, which is the Pathfinder version of it, which is, arguably better. If you really like crunchy rules, play Pathfinder. You're already playing Pathfinder before you're playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. But
that's fair.
Starfinder or Spelljammer, either of those is going to be, I just want to play D&D, but in space. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about systems that do sci-fi really well, because as much as, when we talk about genres, there's some things that other systems can do better because they're genre specific and vice versa. So that's what we're going to talk about.
We briefly discussed at the beginning of the video, Star Wars is fantasy. I don't know why I put it in quotes. No. It's straight up fantasy.
Star Wars is fantasy.
Ignore the air quotes. It's straight up fantasy. So Star Wars is fantasy, but it still has kind of that sci-fi vibe to it, like with certain elements of it.
Yeah, so Star Wars came out in the 70s, early 80s, stuff like that. And as much as it has like elements of science fiction, which is in the future and has technology we don't have, that's not necessarily what makes something sci-fi. It just means that it has those elements. If you look at the core idea of what Star Wars is, there's a magic system. You have literal like heroes' journeys and stuff like that. That contributes more to a fantasy genre than it does to science fiction. And so because of that, the Star Wars RPG, which you can get, it's pretty fun. We enjoyed it. We played a campaign of it. You can use it, but it's mostly going to be more like a heroic fantasy campaign than it is going to be like how you would run a sci-fi campaign.
Yeah. And it's definitely one of those things where when you're in your character creation process, you're going to want to make sure your players are kind of on a similar page, because we found out that if you're not, it kind of gets a little wily.
Yeah, so that's like the big thing is that it, even though you can make an argument that like, but it's sci-fi and this and that, the feel of it isn't sci-fi. And so we're kind of talking about RPGs that feel like sci-fi. And so we'll define what the genre is and stuff like that, and then we'll go into the specifics about which RPGs you might want to enjoy. What
makes science fiction science fiction?
Many historians have been wondering this since the dawn of science fiction itself. I think science fiction is inherently not about the the characters.
Okay.
You're a literary nerd, right?
Yeah. For sure.
Right. You literally taught this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You could probably explain a little bit better the difference between like fantasy as a genre and sci-fi as a genre.
Yeah. So, for where I stand, with fantasy, there's more like you were talking about the hero's journey. It's more specific to again, magic's more of a thing. It's the fantastical in such a way where it can't be explained just with the with the scientific explanation. Whereas science fiction, even like a lot of our modern day things that we've created have come from the ideas of science fiction. If you look at anything from like George Orwell's 1984, any of those older literary books,
any Isaac
Asimov, like like the principles of the robotics or whatever. I forget what they're called.
The 3 rules of robotics.
If you look at those things, they give there's a lot of thought and a lot of thought put into creating those things. So
I also think, just again from a literary perspective, it tends to be more philosophical. Like a lot of the time, it's let's take a problem we have now. And like
exacerbate it.
I mean, that's definitely dystopian, but that's still sci-fi.
Fair, yeah.
And so like if you think of Soylent Green, which spoilers for a movie that's super old, but like everyone knows the plot twist of Soylent Green at this point. The whole point of Soylent Green, if you've never seen it, only know the plot twist, is that it's a dystopian future where these machines are sweeping up the homeless population to get rid of them. But it turns out what they're actually doing is turning them into food to feed everybody else. And so Soylent Green is people is the classic line there. That's kind of like a philosophical thing, is like, well, if you created a economic system where there's so much homeless people that you have to literally feed them to other people, like that's the darker version of that. And a lot of sci-fi is like that. Even the 3 rules of robotics is like that, where it's like, what happens when a robot has to follow these rules? Is there still a way that a robot can cause harm to you, human? And that's really what iRobot is about.
Like iRobot, yeah.
Like not the movie with Will Smith, which does a terrible job of explaining it.
Yeah.
Like the actual story written by Isaac Asimov.
Takes a modern day problem or just a problem that exists in general and kind of makes it into like, well, what if it gets to this point? Like you got to just make it a little bit bigger or maybe a lot bigger than what it is. Like, like overpopulation, pollution, economic disparity, classism, things like that. It really goes the extra mile with that stuff. And then technology plays a huge part in that. And that's really where your sciencey stuff kind of really comes from. Is it takes kind of a philosophical viewpoint, and then what technology could be used to exploit this. So
yeah, and I think that's like the big thing is, can your characters in world explain what is happening? Because like we could be like, oh, but like technology and magic are the same thing to us because we don't know the fine principles of it.
It's a very Marvel way to explain it, but yeah.
No, but like if you can be like, oh, hey, the characters can explain why this thing happens the way it does, like how this works. Like if a gun is broken and you just need to repair it, that's science fiction. Versus if a magic sword loses its essence and you have to find the ancient sage who's the only one who knows how to use it, that's fantasy. And that's kind of like what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And from a like gameplay perspective and a mechanics perspective, that usually means science fiction games have a lot more crunch to them, have a lot more heft in the mechanics, because you have to be able to explain that stuff. It's not just simply, okay, you do magic, let's roll the magic die to see if you do the magic thing, or let's see what happens in this regard, we're just gonna kind of like wing it. Usually when the systems are a little bit more rules light, it uses a magic system that you're not meant to fully grasp and understand, versus sci-fi, which is like, no, your blaster pistol is a technology level of 8 versus this blaster rifle, which is a technology level of 9, which means it's inherently more powerful because of the technology. You can explain it a little bit better.
Now that we kind of discussed like the essence of what a science fiction is, what do these games bring in terms of like mechanics? You said that it'd be more rules heavy, right?
Yes.
A little more crunchier. So.
All right, so let's talk about one of these games first. So Traveler is kind of like the generic sci-fi game.
Right.
And the reason I say that is because there is a lot of rules in Traveler, but it's very piecemeal. You only have to use the parts that you think are important. You don't have to have cybernetic implants, but they have rules for them if you want cybernetic implants. You don't have to have mechs, but they have rules if you want mechs. Right? There's a lot of different things. And so if you're like us and you say hypothetically, I don't know, you want to do a Mass Effect game. Yeah. Right? And you're like, there's no good Mass Effect tabletop RPG. You choose Traveler because it kind of has the same effects, but it explains things to a degree, right? The big point of Traveler is you can like travel, jump from hex to hex, but it takes a week to do that in game. And so then your characters have to literally sit in their little spaceship that they've designed, hopefully, or they've come up with to some extent. And they're like, all right, we're just sitting in here while our engine fuels up and gets to the point ready to jump 1 week away. But it's still taking us a week to get to that point.
And I know, like in our game, it's one of those things where we have to kind of determine what we're doing during those times of, it's not just, we're not just sitting there like, okay, well, it's going to take us a week. And then, okay, it's been a week. It's like, no, we're kind of figuring out what we're doing during that downtime.
And they give you rules for downtime. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like it tells you this is how, like, you're going to be having so much time waiting to jump. You can use that time to then, get better at skills. Yeah. And it's very smart in the fact that you have to do 2-week increments to get better at a skill. Oh, how convenient. In order to jump, you have to go weeks at a time. Very simple thing. And again, that's where it's like more like sci-fi in that it's like very obvious. You get better at this thing because you have spent this X amount of time in order to get better at this thing.
Yeah. It seems like science fiction tabletop games are more about improvement of your skills versus just like, oh, look, I leveled up and I now have this magical ability that I didn't have earlier on. Right. I'm not sure how I got it, but I have it.
Exactly. Yeah. Like that's the problem with like fantasy games is like your character will get a power because they just went from level 4 to 5. And that power is like, this is kind of like insane. Like, how did my character suddenly get the ability to summon a demon? I should probably have some in-lore reason for that, right? Yeah. And it's like, nah, it's fantasy, it's magic, who cares?
The gods willed it,
Right. Versus something like Traveler, if you get a +1, you know how you got that +1.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a 0 in something, you know how you have a 0 in that thing.
Yeah,
it becomes much more rigid in that regard.
Yeah. In the science fiction tabletop games, there's more of an explanation of things that are going on. Your character's more aware of their surroundings and, and even when there's they find themselves in an unknown area, like an unknown situation, they can use that scientific understanding versus, looking at Dungeons and Dragons, you have like, oh, roll me insight or whatever, and who knows what kind of background your character, again, like you're going to have an background, like an in-story background, like oh yeah, my character was a detective, and then whereas this is like, oh, you know what, I work a lot on, I'm a mechanic, so I work, I notice things that are, mechanically, interesting, and so like I'll notice things like that. It's easier to explain why your character is involved with something or while they're doing a certain check.
And again, even like health is like, it's not just, and you suddenly got better. It's like you have to actually work hard in Traveler to regain your hit points. So it more becomes about damage mitigation than it does become about, oh, I just take a bunch of hit points. It's fine. The next day I will have them all back magically. Yeah. It's, oh no, I took 2 hit points. My endurance is now permanently lowered. I can't do that again.
Yeah. That was something that was very interesting about Traveler. I liked that too, because and I think that's the thing with science fiction. There's more of a realism to science fiction than there is, obviously, because again, you're dealing with principles of science. So talk to anybody who's really into physics or biology, and if this is why we have science fiction, is because it's that basis in reality that lets us kind of connect more with it.
Now, conversely, let's say you're like, okay, Traveler, cool. What you're describing sounds fun. I really liked what you said about mechs, though. Like, could I just have a giant robot going full Evangelion or Mobile Suit Gundam on some people? That's where Lancer comes in, which is another fun little sci-fi RPG. Again, with Lancer, the reason we would say this is more of a sci-fi thing is because like you have your mech and you can customize your mech to such a specific degree that it really proves more of that like mechanical crunch to it, right? When you choose a weapon, you are saying this is the weapon I want because it gives me this ability and this ability. When you choose abilities to go on your mech, when you even choose what kind of mech you use, that determines the play style of it. Versus a little like with classes in like D&D, it's like sure it can determine the play style, but then you could choose things that change the play style up a little bit. So like sure you're a paladin, but maybe you focus on healing, or you're a warlock, but suddenly you have the Pact of the Hexblade, and now you can. I know it's not Pact of the Hexblade. Shut up. But now
I like how you just told our viewers to shut up.
Now, but you have Hexblade, and now you can physically harm people, even though you were a spellcaster before, right? With Lancer, you really are like, no, this is my niche. How can I choose things that make my niche the best, right? I got to create a character that is like, the whole point was like, I want him to be versatile. He can support, but he can also be upfront, but he can also be ranged, but he can also like just do a little bit of everything. Knowing that that's not bad, like that's not necessarily the best thing. But what it does is it means if any of our players aren't able to make it, I fill in for that role, right? If Charles, who's our support, isn't able to make it, I can use my leadership dice to at least buff everybody a little bit. If Dunkerton, who's our like tank, who helps people have better cover, isn't there, I can use that ability to help people have better cover. If our frontline fighter and Tanner isn't there, I can be the frontline fighter. And so that was the intent behind like making my character. And it was fun that I got to like do that a little bit coming into a pre-established campaign, being like, I'm just going to do a little bit of everything. One, to test out the system, but two, to also like intentionally fill in gaps where needed.
Again, going into the game, session 0, working with our GM Hunter, I was like, okay, here's what I want. So what's the best mech for this role? And then you pick out, again, there's a bunch of different types of mechs you can be, and each having their own kind of like little special things. Now, you can have some mechs that are a little good at everything. You have some that are good at support, some that are good at up close, some that are good at ranged, So there's a wide variety of mechs you can choose from. It boils down to what do you want to play, and again, like when you're when you level up, you're upgrading your mechs, you're kind of following a path. You kind of stay on this track of like, okay, I start off as support, so what better supports can I add? What is my next level up in support for my character, for my mech? So
and then getting into like the crunch of things, you have like so many resources to use. Right, you can take damage, but then you can use your repair resource. So you're using an action to repair, but now you're getting your hit points back. Right, again, very mechanical, very crunchy. You can lose a bunch of hit points, but you have 4 times that you can do that before your mech starts to explode, which is again like pretty crunchy, and you're just keeping track of all that stuff. You have heat that you can only take so much on before your mech has to cool down, and that's another thing that you can do.
I mean, you kind of look at it like your mech's like your car basically. It's like if your car's overheating, you have to fix it, or it'll continue overheating and then progressively get worse.
But then you can make builds around the fact that you gain a bunch of heat.
Yes,
which is really cool. And then there's like the rules light system, which is with like when you're just your pilots outside of your mechs, which is a very interesting thing. But ultimately, like you play Lancer to be in a mech and like to shoot down mechs and to do stuff like that, which it does very well.
Absolutely. It's a great system. Like you said, basically your combat is you're in mechs. Like that, like when you're doing your combats, that's pretty much all mech stuff. You can technically fight outside of that, but it's not the same. It's very rules light when you're just being the individual that your pilot. Like again, my character is very much a old man who's set in his ways type thing,
and I'm a space knight.
He's a space knight. So it's more fun for that role play aspect. But once you get into combat, like that's where the fun really, in my opinion, the gameplay really shines.
Absolutely,
it's because you're able to well, what can I do? Like even though I'm support, I still have weapons and stuff like that. I can still fight. I'm more of a ranged guy, but like I can shoot out turrets that react. I can shoot out turrets that support and heal. And but sometimes there's a drone that I can shoot out that attaches itself to one of my one of my co-players, and they're their characters, and I will take heat every round. So like again, I've got to be mindful of that. So like I don't want to have that out the whole time, but I'm stuck with it until either I get stunned or so. It's one of those things I've got to use. I've got to really think about it before I could just, can't just go in there and just, and Leroy Jenkins and stuff.
I think that's the only downside I would have to Lancer is if you can't just mindlessly be like, I'm just going to play a barbarian that just hits things.
Correct.
Right. You have to be like intentional about your character build, which means someone in your group has to know how character builds work in this game. And then you have to be intentional about how combat goes.
Yeah.
Right. Like I don't take a lot of heat. So when I use my big F off laser, it's like hey guys, I'm gonna end the combat here. I'm gonna try to get them all in this row. They're all gonna take an insane amount of damage. Which I will say, the one thing is, I bashed D&D about having the math be too small. Lancer's math is even smaller. And for some reason I like it more. I gotta think about it, but I like that. And I also do like how they do like the 20s, where it's like anything that's a 20 or above, including with your modifiers, is considered a crit. That's a great system, and you can really only do it when you have small modifiers like that. So
I think when it comes to science fiction games, it gives you that that aspect of like connecting to your character, like they're very real. It feels very real, what's going on, because while it may not be like, okay, yeah, there's not these biomechanical, monsters, kaiju type stuff that you're fighting necessarily, in real life, but you can see how, like, again, making that reference back to your mech being like your car, that's relatable. If you've driven a car, you own a car, you have to maintain it. Again, it's one of those things. It's just one of those things of real life that just kind of, you can kind of, it really immerses you into the game a little more, I think.
Now, if you're still wanting a little bit of like that Star Wars fantasy, but wanting more like crunch mechanics, I would recommend like either of these two games in the middle. That's Scum and Villainy, and then the Iron Sword Starforged. So, Scum and Villainy is literally just Blades in the Dark, Star Wars. Literally, it's called Scum and Villainy.
Yeah, I wonder where they got that from.
Like, you have the Way, which is this magic essence, and you can use it to do things, and it's like and then you can have it's like a saber made of light or something like that, but it's a lightsaber. Like, you can have all of these things. It's very obviously meant to be Star Wars, but it's still crunchier. Like, they give you a sheet for like, here is how your ship works, right? And it does niche down more than the Star Wars game does. The Star Wars game, you could be mercenaries or diplomats or Jedis or this or that. In Scum and Villainy, you are specifically a crew.
Yeah.
Who wants to like pull off heists and do missions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And the intent behind that is like, okay, you're going to do all your stuff for prepping the heist, then you're going to do the heist, and then you're going to have downtime where you're specifically trying to get the authorities off your back, which fits in with Blades in the Dark, right? Because it's also a heist game. So this is the same thing, but just in space. Versus Iron Sworn, which comes from another fantasy thing. Their first one was Iron Sworn, which was a fantasy game. Starforged is their sci-fi version. And again, it's very similar to that, where it's just like kind of a generic setting, a little bit more on the Star Wars side. But the appeal of it is that it has what's called oracles, which means random tables will happen. Which means you do not need a GM. And we've actually played this game without having a GM, us two and our friend Jeffrey.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that experience?
It was cool because it allowed, especially someone who's always, again, if you're a forever GM like Frank, it allows you to play with them, because sometimes there's that dynamic where you feel like you're playing against the GM a little bit. Like, they want you to succeed, but at the same time, they don't want it to be easy. Maybe you're with a group of friends and none of you have really GM'd before. That would be a great game to play.
Or you have like two players that show up and you're like, well, we don't want to cancel for the third week in a row. Let's play this, because then all three of us get to play and have a little bit more fun.
Yeah, and that's definitely more like one-shot-ish, like more like...
I think you could do a longer term, because they have rules for like progression and stuff like that.
Okay.
You kind of need everyone to understand the rule system enough to be like, because it doesn't say like I attack or I do this or that. They have specific like phrasings where it's like I take on a challenge and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Right, where it's a little bit more vague in what that means, which is kind of what rules like games do. And to some extent it has to be like that, because it needs to allow for all the different options you could do, and then kind of be like, okay, you're doing this crazy thing. That sounds like you're pushing your luck. And so like it just makes it easier. So that way, like when you're rolling for the oracles and rolling to see what happens, it makes it a little bit better there. I do like where it's things like, okay, you can only take these actions when you're in a good position, which makes sense, right? Like if you are like winning the fight, there are certain things you can and can't do.
Yeah, it's nice because that's a level of realism again that science fiction brings to the game. Because in D&D, you could be down to one hit point, and then use one of the crazy, you cast a wish or something, like something just crazy, because you just had it in your back pocket or whatever. You just got fortunate enough, the dice were rolled in your favor. And in fantasy world, that sounds really cool, because again, it's just like watching anime where it's like you just really. Just something happens, where like it's a cool story moments. There's cool story moments where it's like, yeah, I just dug really deep. I willed it to happen. Whereas in science fiction, it's like, hey, like especially with Starforged, it was one of those things where it's like you had to, like, okay, so you're not doing great right now, so you're gonna have some disadvantages in this combat.
I will say the best part about it, and honestly, I think every game group should try it once, is that it forces cooperative storytelling.
Yes.
Because the three of us were playing, and since none of us were the ones controlling the story, when something happened, it's like, all right, Jeffrey, what happened to us? And they're like, he's like, I think we found some weird ooze. And we're like, because we knew that we were in a abandoned research lab. What were they researching? We don't know. And so like, as it moved along, it's like, oh, you describe what we find. Oh, we find like this weird goo. And then it escalates where it's like, and I took a piece of it. It's like, and it's slowly consuming one of the dead corpses. And it's like, oh, there's now a monster to fight in the next room. What's the monster? Well, it's probably a goo monster, right?
Yeah.
And then there's some fun to be had with that. Cause like it, you know, when you have the GM doing only the story, it can get, you know, they have their own specific fantasies and genres and tropes and stuff that they enjoy. But when you force everyone to have to like contribute to the story, it makes it a lot more interesting in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like enforcing that, you know, not forcing, but like having that cooperative gameplay. Again, it really sets it apart from other games. I feel it lets you really tell story collaboratively, which is really fun. You know, and again, I've mentioned this game before. We did a video on it, a Fiasco. You know, which you kind of, you know,
it's the same thing.
It's kind of a similar idea, not identical.
No, it doesn't have oracles.
Yeah, Fiasco's like out there, but you know, this there are rules. There are certain things you can and can't do. While it might be not heavy with the rules, it may be, you know, are not as crunchy as some other games are. It is still enough to like really give you that immersion. Like, you know, it feels like when you're playing the game, you are actually working together as this crew and you know, or as a unit and trying to get through something. And you're creating your own problems too, which is really nice. You know, and if you really look at any like literary or even any story in general, characters very often create their own problems.
Sure. The final one we want to talk about is the Cyberpunk RPG, which did come out before the video game. So if you didn't know that the video game is based off of a TFT RPG, which a bunch of people I know don't know that.
I was one of those people. I did not know that was a tabletop game until after.
Fun fact.
Afterwards.
So the Voodoo Boys, you remember the Voodoo Boys in the game?
Yes.
Like this Cajun group, and they go around and do stuff. In the original version, and it's written by a black guy, so I guess it's allowed. In the original version, they were a bunch of white guys trying to like basically be Cajun and Jamaican and stuff like that.
I love it. That just makes me think of the Island Boys.
And so it's a little funny that that's where they go with. And I'm like, well, the creator was black, so I guess he's allowed to do that. I don't know. Anyway,
I'm not going to question it.
They obviously changed it for the video game.
Yeah.
But so here's the thing about Cyberpunk. I think it does the best job of the existential dread that comes with sci-fi that we've talked about, right? We talked about that like philosophy kind of being one of the points of sci-fi and like the philosophical nature of it. And Cyberpunk has literal rules for cyber madness. Right? This idea that you have given up your humanity so much you are no longer in control of your character, which is a really interesting and fun way to do it. And it becomes a fun push your luck thing where you're like, I want mantis arms that stab people, but if I do that too much or have too many cybernetics, I go crazy.
And I can't hug my children anymore.
Right. So like if you think of the video game where it's like a lot of the things are like, obviously the corpos are in charge and they're running the city, and then you have these really cool street legends like not Keanu Reeves and stuff like that.
Keanu Reeves is always a street legend.
Johnny Silverhands, Adam Smasher, a bunch of them are actually literal legends and like have NPC blocks in Cyberpunk.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of similar to Traveler in the sense that it is a little generic, but because you add in things like cyber madness and like the corpos and stuff like that, it does become very dystopian. In regard to that.
Yeah. There's another video game out there, Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah. It's a little bit.
Yeah. It's again similar idea where it's like, and I like the trope that like, you know, how much can you alter yourself and still be considered human? You know, like when do you start becoming more robot than human? Like, you know, like again, it's those questions that really give sci-fi their oomph, if you will, like their gravitas, their weight. So it's really cool to have that level of like thought put into your game.
As we're wrapping up, Charles, which is like one that, I mean, obviously we're playing Traveler right now, but like what's one that you're like super interested in to play?
I'll be honest. Well, we played Starforged, which I liked, but I think the one I'm most interested in right now, just because we just talked about it, is Cyberpunk, because I do own the video game. I haven't really played it, mostly because it just seems super in depth. And again, I don't know if the tabletop gets that in depth. It's one of those things where it's like, I'm the kind of gamer who's like, just give me a you know, if I'm taking an enhancement, just let me get that enhancement. That's fine. There's a negative quality to it, but like there are things where it stacks and stuff like that. I'm like, I get overwhelmed with that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think Cyberpunk would be one because I like that kind of that world because I like steampunk. So the idea of cyberpunk is actually really cool to me too.
Yeah. So I would say if anyone's interested in like the video game or like we said, like the dystopian like tension that's there, go for Cyberpunk for sure. If you love anime, Lancer obviously.
Oh, for sure.
Right. Use that, get that big off laser and just
yeah. If you want to play with something that where you have robots versus kaijus, Lancer's the way to go
for sure. And then obviously if you want something more adjacent to Star Wars, you could play the Star Wars RPG. But again, that's more fantasy based. If you want to go with a more sci-fi focused one, Scum and Villainy is great. Iron Sword is definitely for like trying out the no GM system. You can play it by yourself because there's no GM. But I do like Traveler because it's piecemeal, because it allows you to like be like, okay, we're going to include this part. Oh, we're not going to include this part. Oh, I'm going to change this a little bit. Right? Like on the Traveler stat sheets, you guys all notice you're like, there's like 6 other skills here.
Yeah.
That we don't have, and it's like luck, sanity, stuff like that. And you're like, why? Like psionics, which you could or could not have in Traveler. It's like, why is this here, Frank? Are we going to use this? And I'm like, yeah, you don't know.
Yeah, it was interesting because like my character just had its first interaction with the sanity one. I was like, oh, and I have no idea what it means. I just know I filled in a block, or basically, or I have one in it now. So
yeah, we'll see what happens.
I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's good or bad.
We'll find out. But yeah, thank you guys for joining us. If you enjoyed what we talked about, leave us a like, comment, subscribe. Let us know specifically which of these you would want to try out. If there's a RPG we didn't talk about, and you're like, how could you guys not talk about that? It's in the thumbnail. What's wrong with you, Frank? We did that because, thumbnails have to be engaging and cool. So let us know.
So thanks again for joining us. Safe travels, and I can't do the Spock thing.
I thought you were doing the Jedi mind trick.
Yeah.
Stay witty.
Stay witty. Oh, wrong camera. Stay witty.